right, fifth and final round. Let's see if our opponent sticks around as long as our last opponent did. So this hand we cannot keep. We're on the draw. Same situation that has happened at least once before, where we have the border post and the Nykthos and no plains. So you can't play the border post for one without a plains because you have to pick up the plains. If this were a plains, I would keep this hand because you start with the opening hand action of Leyline on the battlefield, and then you play the plains Wayfarer. Then the following turn you can pick up the plains to play border post, and then replay the plains, and then whenever the opponent plays, even if we're on the play, and then on the next turn they play their second land, and then you can activate the Wayfarer to find, say, the Nykthos or whatever. Or you could just play another Wayfarer and then untap and activate both, get like a Plains and a Nykthos, and you could just do all kinds of things at that point, and basically be able to start securing and whatnot. But as it stands, we can't keep this hand because of this Nombo, even on the draw. I think we're okay to mulligan. Now this hand is pretty questionable because even though we have the double ley line, we have no lands, and if we get to scry, and if it's not a plains, we scry it to the bottom, then we draw. But if that's not a plains, we're just missing our first turn land drop. If you are on the, I guess if we're on the play, it's kind of the same thing. I think this hand is closer than you might think at first glance, because we do have the Wayfarer and the Knight to catch back up from the mulligan. And the Wayfarer can get us the Nykthos, and the double ley line and the Knight can power out the Nykthos. So, I mean, if we just like scry to the bottom and peel a plains or scry plains to the top or whatever, then this hand could actually be good. You know, you play the Wayfarer and then you go get another plains and play the Knight to get a plains, then you play the Nykthos and you just play Elishnorn. So yeah, I mean, this hand is actually pretty close, and I'm not convinced that it's correct to mulligan it, but I did end up mulliganing it. And this one we definitely keep. Knight, yeah, we'll take that. So cycles, this dredge. No, oh, this is Traverse the Ovenwald. Either a rock deck or a Death Shadow deck. Still unclear which one it is. Now we're just setting up for the Wayfarer. Takes our Ballista. We're not interested in trading at this point. We'd rather just get lands out of our deck. We're going to go ahead and get Nykthos here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get a plains, play a Knight, get a plains, pick it up, play the other border post. Now we're going to take a big hit here, but then we're set up to cast all our spells for the rest of the game, basically. An X spell would be really good. Didn't find one. We'll get another Nykthos so we can power out a huge Secure if we draw it, or a huge Ballista. So just play Gideon with excess mana. And now we're basically, any sort of top deck puts us in great shape. And even without a top deck, we're still kind of treading water reasonably well. Oh, that was a good top deck. So we make Gideon a creature, attack with everyone. They fatal push, so might as well just do it in response. Could get blown out by Maelstrom Pulse, but I think they would have used it on the Gideon if they had it. So we're just going to make 9 tokens. And that's game. So still not sure what they are, if they're like they played a Stomping Ground, so I know they're Jund. It's either Jund midrange with Traverse just as, you know, a value type card, or it could be the Death Shadow deck. I remember the Jund Death Shadow was a thing before Grixis Death Shadow kind of overtook it in popularity. So I'm not convinced that we were supposed to mulligan that 6-card hand, but we ended up mulliganing into a 5-card hand that panned out pretty well. So yeah, we could actually just chump block, emblem Gideon on our turn and just kill him with warriors, or we could probably kill the opponent multiple different ways from this board. But yeah, secure for 9 on what was that, turn 4? We did that, something like that, turn 5. So yeah, that was pretty quick, pretty powerful hand the way that developed on a mulligan to 5. The Wayfarer did a lot of work, found us our lands, including our Nykthos, to power out our spells. And all it took was, I mean, they Inquisitioned our first X spell. Ballista would have been, just as devastating as the Secure. We would have just Nykthos, played the other Nykthos, activated it, played Ballista for like 6 or something, and that would have dominated the board pretty heavily. But Secure was just even better. Um, so yeah, sideboard for this matchup. Since we're not really sure whether it's mid-range or Death Shadow, I'm gonna go with Death Shadow because I feel like whenever you see key cards that are in stock versions of a list, it's better to assume that the opponent is playing that stock archetype. I never noticed there's a horse in this background. Dude on a horse. That's pretty cool. I like horses. So anyway, so we're going to assume that this is the Death Shadow deck because Traverse is in the stock Death Shadow, but it's not in stock Jund midrange. But it still could be Jund midrange. So we're going to bring in the 4 Wrath of Gods, which we would not bring in against Jund midrange, but we definitely would bring in against Death Shadow. We're going to bring in the 2 Devout Lightcasters, which come in regardless, because it can kill Liliana, Dark Confidant, Death Shadow, Tasigur, whatever. They might not have like Tasigur and Gurmag Angler type thing because they want to fill up their graveyard for Traverse. But if they're, let's say, playing a Traverse deck, they probably have Grimflayer if they're not a Death Shadow deck, and Devout Lightcaster also kills Grimflayer. So we're definitely bringing in the 2 Flayers and the 4 Wraths. We're going to bring in the 2 Rest in Peace as well, because that shuts off, makes Tarmogoyf a 0/1, and turns off the Delirium for Traverse and whatever other sort of shenanigans they have going on. They could have Culligan's Command, stuff like that. So we definitely want those. We don't want Cage because they're not really doing any sort of flashback stuff, but we definitely want Rest in Peace. We can take out the Nevermores. Not really any super important thing to name with that. We're going to take out the Elishnorns because it's a pretty expensive card and it doesn't actually kill really any of their threats. So it's just kind of a card that'll sit in our hand for a while, and then we finally cast it, and it's good on the board. But then like they have cards, they probably have Terminate or something like that. So it's just probably one of our weakest cards. Then I also cut 3 to 4 copies of the Ballistas. Just because like they do have Fatal Push to kill it, and they don't have a lot of small creatures. So kind of the same reason that we're not keeping Elishnorn in the deck. It's because they don't really have any creatures that easily die to it. When they're playing, big creatures out of their deck, we'd rather be wrathing them, wrathing away like Death Shadows and whatnot, instead of trying to, you know, beat a Death Shadow with a Ballista. That's not really a winning matchup. So that's how we sideboard. Even though we're not 100% clear what our opponent's doing, we have a decent idea. So this hand, we have the Rest in Peace, so that could be good. It'll shut down a lot of their stuff. We don't have an opening Leyline, so they probably have a discard spell since they have Inquisition and Thoughtseize. And when they play their discard spell, they're going to take our Rest in Peace. We're going to have 5 lands and a Wayfarer. So I don't want to just die to, a single discard spell, so I'd rather just mulligan this hand. This hand is not great, but it is a little resistant because if they Inquisition us, they could take like our border post or secure the waste, and that's fine. But if they Thoughtseize us, they'd have to choose. Do I want to try to, get them off one of these cards, or do I take their Elspeth now while I can? Like we already have the Nykthos. I think that this type of hand, when you have like 4 lands, and we're counting the border post as a land, I think that you keep this on 6. I'd probably, like if this were another land or something, I would mulligan the 7 card hand, but on 6 you have to, you can't be as liberal with the mulligans because mull to 5, even though we won game 1 on a mull to 5, you're generally at a pretty big disadvantage on a mull to 5. And the opponent didn't mulligan either, so we'd be down 2 cards. Quarantine Field, that's, that's kind of helpful. We don't know how helpful it's going to be, but we have the Nykthos, so it can help us to set up. And it'll kill their first threat. But we did end up putting it to the bottom, though, because our hand is kind of clunky, where we already have X spell, 6 mana spell, and like nothing really else going on. And Quarantine Field doesn't do anything until, 4 mana. So if our first card we cast this game is on turn 4, it's kind of like, well, the opponent has to have a pretty bad draw for us to win with that. So I decided to scry it to the bottom, even though, we could regret it. And we ended up drawing a Rest in Peace, which is pretty useful. They are Death Shadow, and that's pretty good. They have 2 of them already. Alright, so we could Path, but I'd rather get this Rest in Peace active right away. Culligan's Command or Porter Post, that's pretty brutal. This game's looking rough. We're at 4, they have a pair of 8/8s, and we don't have a lot of outs, that's an out. Okay, well that was pretty lucky. So Inquisition, yeah, we got a response to that. Let's go ahead and take care of that first one. Now let's go ahead and take care of that second one. And our board went from being utter nothingness to now we're just in a top deck war, and that helps. Gets us a land, gets us closer to Elspeth. We can cast Elspeth next turn off of Nykthos. No, we can't. Not quite yet. Well, all right. Can't cast Elspeth anymore. It's not there. Oop, we can cast that one. That one's good. All right. Since you dealt yourself like most of the damage, Knight's almost good enough by itself. You're down to 1. I barely did anything to you, but you basically killed yourself because you're a Death Shadow deck. Boom! Can't beat a Knight, a Gideon, and an ally, so you just committed suicide with your own Verdant Catacombs. So wow, yeah, we mull 5 game 1, defeat the opponent with a Secure the Waste and a Gideon. And then game 2, they basically tear apart our hand, get a pair of Death Shadows, make them into 8/8s, attack us down to 4, and then repeal the second Path to Exile, kill their 2 Death Shadows, and then they Thoughtseize our Elspeth, and we draw a Knight, and then a Gideon, and they just die basically to the Knight of the White Orchid. So yeah, this is, I mean, Death Shadow, I would have liked to see a game 3 here because this matchup is, it has a lot of things that are, I'm not really sure how close it is. It could be in our favor. It could be a harder matchup. It could be real close. But I know we have a lot of kind of haymakers where if they just kind of go crazy and play all their Tarmogoyfs and Death Shadows, and we just cast our Elspeth and minus it, we can wipe their board. And then when we sideboard, we bring in our Wrath of Gods, which are kind of a similar type of trump, where it restarts their game and they have to find more threats. And we also have the Rest in Pieces, so they can't rely on Culligan's Command to re-find more threats from their graveyard. And the Rest in Peace also shuts down their Tarmogoyfs, which are one of their main threats. And so then they are basically relying extra heavily on Death Shadow. And then we have not only 4 Path and 2 O-Ring, but we also have a Quarantine Field, even a second one if we want it. We have 4 Wrath of God and 2 Devout Lightcaster and 2 Elspeth to minus and kill their stuff. So we have a ton of answers to their things. And even if we don't draw enough answers for their threats, even though we actually have more answers than they have threats that we need to deal with, if we happen to not draw enough, we could just like cast a large Secure the Waste and just chump block and attack back. Because in order for Death Shadow to be a legitimate threat, they have to put themselves on a low life total. So if we just secure for like 5 or 6 and chump block and attack back, they might just be dead, you know? So we have a lot of things going on in this matchup, and I'm interested to see how it plays out after I play a few more matches against Death Shadow. But it feels like we're certainly able to hang with them, and even after I mean, what we mulliganed 3 times in 2 games and won both of them. I mean, yeah, we top decked some key cards at key moments, but like that's kind of what our deck is set up to do. We're almost like a Tron deck where we have all these enablers to generate a bunch of mana, and then we just draw a payoff card, and that payoff card is like a huge impact on the game. It's like a Secure for 9, or a huge Ballista, or an Elish Norn, or an Elspeth that dominates the board. Um, so yeah, it's just kind of the way this matchup I would think would go a lot of the time, since we do have a lot of answers to their threats, and our haymakers are bigger and more powerful than their haymakers. But anyway, yeah. So this deck evidently is able to compete with some of the top strategies. It has some really explosive draws with the opening hand action of Leyline on turn 0. Can really generate some extra mana with Nykthos to cast our spells pretty quickly. And cards like Knight of the White Orchid allow us to really snowball our mana into big, powerful threats pretty quickly. Against Affinity, we had a turn 3 Elspeth against a really aggressive draw that allowed us to come back. This draw, we had a couple of Path to Exiles that allowed us to um, stay in the game, to draw into a Planeswalker and a Knight to win the game. Some of the other matchups, we just played an out grindy type game where we just produced a bunch of mana and eventually played like a Ballista or a Secure the Waste and took over the game. So there's just a lot of things that this deck is capable of doing, and it really attacking on multiple different axes. So it's really hard for the opponent to really just focus on one sort of way to attack us. So some decks in the format you have like Tron or Valakut, where it's like, oh well, I'm going to attack your lands, and there's not much you can do about it. That's just an effective way to cripple your deck. Or if you're playing a deck like Affinity or Lantern, and it's like, well, all right, you had the Stony Silence, or some mass artifact hate. I guess I can't win. Or you're playing like a Dredge deck or a Living End deck, and it's like, well, yep, you packed enough Graveyard hate. Guess I'm not going to beat you. This deck, there's really no way to just be like, well, you expected my deck and you packed the answers, so I can't win. Because like, what are you gonna do? Like, if you attack my mana, okay, what are you doing? Like killing my Nykthos? Well, I have like 4 Wayfarers to find more Nykthoses. Nykthoses? Is that how you say that? I have no idea how to use that as plural. But yeah. So the deck is pretty cool. It's fun. It's mono white, so obviously, I'm in love with it. But I think it could use some tuning. I'm going to continue to work on it and try out a few different iterations. I would encourage you to play this deck at F&M or any sort of other local tournament and let me know how it goes. And also let me know if you have any cool suggestions for this deck, because I feel like there's a lot of different ways that you can build a white devotion deck. And I just kind of showcased some of the powerful things that this deck can do. But I think this archetype in general, there's a lot of other powerful things that you can also do. So I hope you enjoyed these videos and that you learned a few things. And that's it for today.